Hello everyone, this is an introductory Photoshop tutorial where I will teach you the basics in Photoshop needed to edit images and drawings for a portfolio. So when you open Photoshop for the first time, it might look like something like this, although you might not have your previous files open that are located here. But to start, you just click Open and browse to where you have your images saved on your computer. I would recommend getting organized, so putting photographs and drawings in folders that are labeled by project, perhaps by year, by studio, and then name the files in a way that you can understand what they are later. So browse and open the file that you'd like to start with. I'm going to start with the transformation drawings. I'm going to open both halves of my transformation drawing in an effort to combine them. So if you scanned your transformation drawing in two parts, go ahead and open both of them. If you've scanned it in one part, you can just open one. But just to give you a basic rundown of Photoshop, the left-hand side is where the toolbars are. This is where all the tools will be that you'll use. The right-hand side, there's a series of different panels, and on the top there's this bar that changes according to which tool you're using. So just notice that this changes as we're using the different tools as the tutorial goes on. Along the top you have these different options. If your workspace doesn't look like this, if you go to Window, Workspace, you can choose Essentials. There's different workspace options that bring up different panel arrangements. The one I'm going to use is just the Essentials. If ever you're missing any of the tools or you accidentally close out of a panel, if you go to Window, there's all these different options for tools and panels to select to bring them back open. One of the first things to understand about Photoshop is that it works using layers, which on the right-hand side, if you hover over anything, it gives you the title of what it is. The layer panel looks like two sort of rectangles at an angle or two diamonds. The way layers work is that anything that is on top or above on the list of the layers, that's on top in the drawing. That comes in handy to understand when we start to add different things within this drawing. On the right-hand side, you see this little lock here. That means that the layer, you can't draw on it or edit it. So sometimes if you have something that you really don't want to accidentally draw on top of, locking layers by hitting the little lock button makes some sense. When you notice that as I'm clicking to make a new layer down here at the right, you can create a new layer. Notice as I click on the layers themselves, the highlighted blue part shows me which layer I'll actually be drawing on inside of the drawing itself. You can adjust things by layers, such as like opacity, the type of filter. So if you wanted to have something that was a little transparent, you could change that by adjusting the opacity. To delete a layer, you can click, hold, and drag it down to the trash can, or you can simply select it and then hit the trash can and it'll ask you if you want to delete the layer. So that's just the layer panel. I'll go over some of the other tools as we go through the tutorial. But the first thing I want to do is I want to get the other half of my drawing into this same drawing as the bottom half. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to right click on the layer in one file and hit duplicate layer, and then this is like asking you what you want to name it. I'll just leave it as background copy, that's fine. But I want to duplicate it into my other document. So I'm going to duplicate it into Transformation 001, which is the other document I have open, hit OK. So then if I click back to Transformation 1, again notice up here I have two different files open. So now I'm in Transformation 1 and I can see that I've duplicated that bottom half of my drawing into the layer. I'm going to zoom out by holding Alt or Option and then scrolling with my mouse. And then what I want to do is I want to make my image bigger on the screen. So notice as I click and drag this image around, it kind of disappears behind the black space. So what I want to do is I want to make my canvas size large enough to show both images. So I'm going to go to Image, Canvas Size, and I'm going to increase the height. So my width is going to be the same. I'm going to increase the height so that it's big enough. I'm just going to put 16 for now. so that I can get both images on the canvas itself. So I'm going to slide the bottom part down. I'm going to unlock by clicking the little lock button, the top part of the image, and I'm going to slide it up. And so my scan, you know, it looks like I scanned half and I scanned the other half, and you can see this is kind of where the top half lines up. So I'm actually going to drag the top layer up, and then I'm going to change the opacity just so that I can kind of see for now how the image lines up, and I'm just going to drag it down until I visually start to see it kind of overlapping. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I'm just going to line that up until it looks pretty good. Zoom back out, and then I'm going to change that opacity back to 100%. And then I will also then go ahead and crop my canvas size back down to meet the whole image itself. So on the left-hand side of the image, there's the crop button. And so I click that, and then notice the little sort of rectangular little corners, and then this little bar here. As I hover my mouse over it, it's giving me the option to size things. So I'm just going to click this one, click and drag until it kind of snaps with the height. And then I've cropped my image back down to the full size. I'm actually going to go ahead and hit save now. So when you hit Command S or Control S, it kind of gives you an option, pulls up this save as window. I'm just going to tell it where I want it to save. I'm going to name it up here. I'm just going to call it as transformation drawing. And I'm going to save it in my transformation folder, save it accordingly on your computer, and then I'm going to save it as a Photoshop file. So I want to save it as a Photoshop file so I can come back and edit it later. Notice that there's a bunch of different options. You can, I typically, when I'm working on images and editing them, keep them as Photoshop files right until the end, and then I'll export them or save them as JPEGs so that the file size is a little smaller, but the working file wants to be Photoshop. So hit Photoshop and then hit save, and then OK. So the next thing I want to do with this is it's looking a little yellow, and I can see some of my paint strokes with the lighter colors that aren't reading quite as cleanly as some of the other painted areas on the drawing itself, which is fine. You can kind of cheat and get that out of there. Nobody needs to know if you were great at gouache or not on the first day or two. So I'm going to first make this image a little bit more black and white and play also with the contrast because it's looking a little dull. So I'm actually going to do this using what are called adjustment layers. So I'm going to go Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'm going to do black and white. And then notice I'm just going to let it be called black and white, hit OK, and then it opens up this Properties window. I'm just going to ignore that for now. The other layer I'm going to open is Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and then Brightness and Contrast. And then it's asking me what I want to name it, and I'm just going to say OK. And then notice that the Properties window changed again. So I'm actually going to go back to the layers, and notice that it made, the two rectangles at the top. Notice that it made two new layers. One was called black and white, and then one was called Brightness Contrast. So I'm going to actually show you. So when you click on the little icon, if you double click on the icon, on the left, it opens sort of up the properties window where you can edit sort of things about that layer. And so if I go back to the layer panel, maybe I want to mess with the brightness contrast. Again, I double click on that little icon. In this case, it's a half sun. In this case, it's a rectangle with one side that's white and one side that's black. But I'm going to update the brightness contrast. So if I want to make things a little bit brighter, sliding the scroll bar all the way to the end, notice it makes it super washed out. I can up the contrast, which just takes like the whites and the blacks and makes them more extreme, and the grays sort of get a little bit faded. You can notice if I put it back to 0, it's a little bit, you can see a little bit more contrast between the dark gray and the light gray. If I turn the brightness all the way up, suddenly those medium grays sort of go away. The lightest grays completely get washed out. So you might adjust that a little bit just until you have like this sort of, it's all eyeball, of course, but this sort of good balance of contrast and brightness in your image. So I might just up the contrast a little bit and up the brightness a little bit. So then the next thing, and then notice with the black and white turned off, it's kind of subtle, but you can kind of see when I turn that eyeball off, it turns the layer off. It makes it a little bit more yellow than when I have it on. So it's true black, white, and gray when you have the black and white filter on, just as a heads up. So the next thing I want to do is I want to kind of clean up, I'm not going to clean up all of them, but some of the paint strokes. You can do this in your drawing as much as you need to, but this looks like an area where I was a little bit sloppy with my gouache, or maybe I was getting used to it. So I'm actually going to turn the brightness and contrast and black and white off for this, just because I think it's easier to see. You can leave them on, no problem. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new layer by clicking this, again, the little new layer button at the bottom. And then I'm going to come over and use what's called the clone stamp tool, which is the little thing that looks like a stamp. And notice when I move it over, it changes, and there's like this circle that you can see. If I hit the brackets on the keyboard to the right, it makes the size larger, and then the left bracket makes the size smaller. So get used to that. Hotkeys or keys on the keyboard make things faster. You can certainly change the size by coming up to the top and scrolling, but I find that having to click up at the top left over here every time I want to change the size of my brush to be kind of annoying. Also notice that there are options for different types of brushes you can use. Right now I'm using kind of this like faded, fuzzy looking soft brush. But if I, again, right bracket to make it bigger, left bracket to make it smaller, that's going to actually control how I stamp with my clone stamp. And then if I hold the Option or Alt key, what that does is it brings up, notice that it changes from the circle where I'm painting with or stamping to what you want to clone. So what I want to do is I want to clone this nice gray area and kind of cover over the brush marks. So I'm just going to hold Option and Alt to like kind of eyedrop where I want to clone from, and I click once. So click to, you can click as many times as you want really, but click and then release the Alt button to sort of paint that same gray over the brush strokes. So notice when I click, a tiny little faint plus sign, I'll zoom in so you can see, a faint plus sign appears to show me where it's matching from. So if I ever need to like re-eyedrop, I can simply hold Alt again and then hit click and then paint sort of that same color. Now, this is like a really nice way for sort of matching textures, so you can imagine you could do this with things other than solid gray areas as well. I wouldn't want to necessarily use the typical paintbrush and try and paint this because there's a little bit of texture to the paper here, and I think clone stamping is what's going to get you sort of an idealized painted look. I could certainly draw like solid rectangles or parallelograms and fill them in with gray, but I think what I really want to do is just sort of clean up the painting itself rather than like redraw this digitally. In some cases it might be good to redraw, but I think in this case I want it to still read like a painting. So I would go and I would do that. One of the things that might not be preset that you might want to check is when you make the new layer here, you're technically drawing on the layer. The one thing you want to double check is up at the top here that it says current and below, or all layers would work. So all that means is I'm going to paint on the new layer, so I could always delete it or hide it if I wanted to later. But it's cloning from the painting below. So just double check that that's selected. It might not default that way if you're using Photoshop for the first time. So double check that. And to get like very clean edges, you can also select where you paint. So perhaps you wanted a really straight edge, and I have a round brush. So what you can do is you can use the lasso tool, which is this one here. Click that, and then I'm going to draw sort of the straight line. Maybe I'll just trace around like that. And so now when I go back to the clone stamp here, what will happen is I'll select the area, again holding Alt, that I want to paint with, but then when I go to paint, it will only fill in sort of in the area where I have what's called like the marching ants selected. So that'll give me a straight edge that I'm not worried about painting in the dark gray area. So that is the clone stamp tool and the lasso tool. And so I would go through and I would clean up kind of the rougher areas with the lighter colors until I had that kind of all set. And then I think I turned back on my black and white and contrast layers. Again, you want to save every once in a while. But then, so once I completely finished cleaning up this file, the next thing I would do is I would save out a JPEG. So to do that, I go File, Save As, and then instead of Photoshop, I want to save this as a JPEG so that way it flattens everything. It's not as big of a file that way, so my portfolio size doesn't get too big. The Photoshop file will be a large size because it has all of the information. You can kind of see here it's 57 megabytes already, but I want to save out a drawing that's smaller than that but still looks good. So I'm going to save out a JPEG. Notice that it doesn't save the layers automatically. That's okay. I'm going to save it just in the same folder, and then I'm going to hit save. And then this is where you can choose the file size. Now this is where I would just start with large. If you ever get to, like, if you have a file that you're working on that's really, really big and got lots of detail, you can get away with trying something that's smaller, like of quality, and then hit OK. And then it just does it. It saves it out. And notice you still have the Photoshop file open, but it saved the JPEG in that folder for you. And then you can use that in your actual portfolio itself. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and edit a couple more things just to show you a couple more tricks. So I'm going to go, again, File, Open, and then I'm going to browse. Let's see. Let's do my 100+1. I'm going to edit some 100+1 images. So I'm just going to actually open, if you click and hold Shift, you can open multiple files at one time. So I'm just going to open all of my 100+1 images for now and see what they look like. So maybe your 100+1 looks something like this, and you have like a series of sort of detail photos of it, maybe a close-up shot, far away shot, and then maybe you did some kind of drawing. I think in this case, this student did several different types of drawings, which could be nice in a portfolio. So what I'm first going to do is I'm going to edit this detail photo. So one of the things you might want to do with your images is sort of adjust the brightness. In this case, I might take out, like this looks like it was taken in the studio, maybe not down in the photo lab. And I just want to kind of edit out that line between the pinup board panels, and maybe the brightness of this, I could increase it a little bit. So let's go, again, up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I'm going to update the brightness contrast, hit OK. Again, just to show you, notice that it made a new layer for it here. I'm going to click on the sun. I'm just going to brighten it up. I don't want it to be too washed out, but I do think, like, the photo's pretty good, but the brightness is a little odd, a little dark. So I think that looks pretty good. And then I'm going to use the clone stamp again. So I made a new layer. I'm actually going to pull it down below the brightness contrast by clicking and dragging. I'm going to turn off the brightness contrast for now. And I'm going to come over to the clone stamp, and then notice that the painting area is pretty small in this case, so I'm going to use the right bracket to make it bigger, maybe that size, and then I'm going to hold Option to kind of select, and then I'm just going to stamp some of that textured pinup board over that joint. I think if you have taken photos in the photo lab, you'll be even in a better condition, but in some cases, and it's okay to have photos that are in studio as long as they're nicely lit and there's not like a ton of things around, so in the background. Like, you don't necessarily want them to have like cutting boards or Sobo bottles in the background, but if they have, you know, white pinup board, I'm okay with that. So notice I used the lasso tool to kind of draw along that card edge. Then I'm going to just clone stamp the shadow, being careful to try and kind of pay attention to the image around me. So that looks pretty good. And then maybe I would clean up this part too. I won't make you do that. So that looks pretty good. The other thing that you might want to do when you've taken photos is sort of edit sort of the rotation. So one of the things that you can do in Photoshop is kind of rotate images, you can scale images. So if I hit Control T or Command T option, it allows you to switch. So Command T is the transform tool, and notice when I hover my mouse around the corners, kind of like the crop tool, what it does is it's allowing me to try and scale the image. If I move it just to the top, notice that it gives me the option to rotate, so I can actually like rotate. So maybe you want to, if you have an image you need to rotate, I don't know if I would rotate that upside down, but as I'm rotating, one thing, I can see it now, you can see how the clone stamp moved separate from my image. So one thing you want to do is either rotate before you clone, or you can merge your clone stamping onto the layer itself, or you click a layer, hold Shift, and notice they're both highlighted, select both of them, and then hit Command T, and then rotate the stamp action with the tool. So you need to rotate something. Maybe I for some reason I want to rotate my image a little bit that way. Hit Enter, and then I'll crop using the crop tool. Kind of crop out kind of the part of the image that I don't need. This one, the framing wasn't that bad for a detail shot, but in case you need to crop out some things, use the crop tool on the left. Hit Enter, and there's my image. Again, the next thing I might do is hit Save As, and save it out as a JPEG. So with drawings, I would say similar thing to the photos. Maybe I'll just go to a drawing now. One of the things you want to look at is the brightness. A lot of times when you scan a drawing, it looks kind of dull or gray. So same thing, I'm going to go Layer, New Adjustment Layer. I think I'll do Brightness Contrast with this one, and then another one, Layer, New Adjustment Layer. Sometimes Curves is good with drawings. Curves allows you to edit sort of the gray in a drawing, so if you've used like pencil, sometimes curves can be helpful in like keeping some of the gray without losing everything. So I'm going to turn the brightness up, and I'm going to turn the contrast pretty far up in this case because I used ink. I'll show you how curves works too. If you've used some pencil, sometimes the brightness contrast can get rid of the pencil lines. So what curves can do, again, double clicking on the symbol itself. So with curves, I can sort of bring out some of the gray in the drawing more individually. So notice that the gray is changing, whereas the black of the pencil isn't. It's a little different than when you're updating contrast, where it's just trying to, the brightness and the contrast just tries to make everything very, very bright or very, very dark. Curves allows you to kind of edit within a drawing, especially if you've used pencil. You can more easily manipulate the grays with curves. So you can play around with curves and brightness contrast depending on what you've used, and notice how much brighter that is. I'm going to turn the brightness pretty far up in this case. And so that already, I've lost a little bit of the detail, but that already looks a little bit better than that dull sort of scan or photograph did. If you have scanned it and there's like scanner marks, you can clean those out again with the clone stamp tool. You can clean up any errors in your drawing the same way I was cleaning up with the paint in the transformation painting. One thing that's kind of nice is once you've done this, so let's say you did brightness contrast, you did curves, and you edited sort of with adjustment layers, you can actually duplicate adjustment layers into files. So if I right click on the layer, hit duplicate layer, and then I find one of my other drawing files, like 06, I believe is a drawing, hit OK. If I go there, notice that that brightness contrast drawing layer is in my drawing already. So I can kind of duplicate that to all of my drawings, and then you can always edit them accordingly if you needed to. But so kind of interesting. So duplicating that, save some steps. One of the things you might do is turn the drawing black and white, just because I can kind of see a little bit of brown in a weird way with that marker. So again, layer, new adjustment layer, black and white, hit OK, and then see how that kind of brownness goes away. And then I think again, you can go through and you can play around with, getting some of those pencil marks out by or ink marks out by taking the contrast or the brightness down a little bit. The other thing you can do is go through and clone stamp and get some of those marker strokes out. Something else you might do to drawings is if you've scanned them or taken a photo and there's like not a ton of space in the drawing, like where it got cropped in a weird way, you can actually increase a canvas size as well. So if you go Image, Canvas Size, you can make it, again, larger. So if I wanted to make it a little bit, it's going to grow the image. Whatever down here, the color is that's below is going to make, that's what color the sort of growth will be. So in this case, I've just given it a little bit more room to breathe. Sometimes that's helpful too. If you can scale the image then if you'd like to by clicking Unlock and then Command T. If I hold Shift when I'm clicking and dragging from a corner, that keeps the proportion. If I don't hold Shift, it allows you to warp the drawing in a way that's not very nice. So again, click, drag, Command T, click and drag, holding Shift, it keeps it proportional. If you wanted to scale things, sometimes having multiple images in one file is kind of nice, or you can have them separately and then you can lay them out later in another software like InDesign. So that's scaling, that's using adjustment layers. I'm going to hit Save, and then it's a good idea to be saving, like to save frequently just in case your computer decides to take a break. So again, save it accordingly, save out a JPEG file, save as JPEG. Whenever you're saving a final image for a portfolio, you can save a Photoshop file as the working file. Okay. You want to link JPEGs in your portfolio itself. Okay, and then I think the last thing maybe that I will touch on is maybe with just the volume cube. So I'm going to go File, Open. I'm going to navigate to my volume cube, and then I'm going to open, let's do a model photograph of it. So depending on where you took your photos, if you took them in the photo lab or if you took them in studio, you might need to edit the brightness contrast. So in this case, this is on a black background, which is nice because it contrasts my white model, but I definitely want some contrast in the image because it's reading pretty dark. So I'm going to do New Adjustment Layer, Brightness Contrast, hit OK, and then edit the brightness this way. And then just as a heads up, there's other types of adjustment layers here that you could play with. So if you wanted to mess with the color, the saturation of an image is really helpful. We'll talk about that later this semester, but there are other sort of options that you can explore with if you're using any colored images this semester for your portfolio. So that is already looking a little bit better though with the brightness contrast. I think in this case, one of the things you could look for in editing photos is certainly if you have like some dirt or fingerprints or smudges, or if you've got like some really rough cuts. Obviously the clone stamp is a great tool for drawings, but just to point out that you can do it nicely in combination with the lasso tool in models as well. So not only can you sort of cut out information from the background or clean up the backgrounds of images, but you can also sort of trace around and clean up sort of the actual model photos themselves too by smoothing things out a little bit. Again, I'm going to change the size of the clone stamp by hitting the bracket. So just kind of cleaning up some of that, I'm not sure what this is, dirt might be not a bad idea. Command Z is undo, so if you ever go a little too far, you can undo something. And then obviously the sort of beauty of it being on a layer is you can always start over if it gets too bad. So I think I'd clean that up a little bit, try and smooth out some of those fingerprints. Sometimes you can make it worse if you go too far, but you can always undo. And then play around with the brightness contrast to kind of clean up some of that. Maybe brightness contrast you can do a lot with ahead of time, and then cleaning up any of the rough cuts. I think this model is like pretty well done, but if you have giant holes in yours, kind of clone stamping and cleaning those up could be helpful. I think, again, saving out as JPEGs. We'll go over the other tools and panels in Photoshop as we move through the semester. But this has been an introductory Photoshop tutorial for editing images for your portfolio.